Hi,
All
my name is
right.
Clayton Moore. I am the mechanics designer and the founder of, or co-founder of All Chat Entertainment. And today I have a friend of the group with me, Matt. Matt, how are you doing?
I'm pretty good. How are you?
I'm alive.
Yeah. Yeah, I
uh,
feel that.
so I appreciate you coming on. Tonight I wanted to talk a little bit about the game that we've been producing for about the past year. I've been producing it for about the past year, and then about 10 months ago, I asked five other friends of ours, mutual friends of ours, to help me work on the game. And yeah, so for about the past 10 months, they have been helping me produce that, and we are getting close to the Kickstarter. We are approaching in about 9 weeks, so a little over 2 months. The Kickstarter will be fully launched. So I wanted to have you on just to kind of talk about the game as somebody that has not played it and does not know all of the does not know everything about it, and so we can kind of share some of the updates and talk about the game for some people that might be interested in playing it. So I understand that you have some questions prepared.
Yeah. I wrote some questions and I was like, well, we'll just kind of talk and see where it goes on, but at least I've got, like a starting point.
Yeah.
So I guess like for the first question, so like I come from a background of playing lots of like TTRPG, so I know what
Hmm.
a tabletop role playing game is, and so I'm
Right.
pretty sure the game is a tabletop role playing game.
It is.
So
Yeah.
I figured I'd ask you just like if you could start, what is this game?
So this game is a TTRPG that is focused on being as beginner friendly as possible. We try to make the rules as simple as possible, and we want to make it as inclusive to bring as many new players in.
Right.
I started making TTRPG content about a year and a half ago on TikTok, and so many of the comments that I received were about, oh, I would love to play my first game on a TTRPG, but, or, I haven't played in 20 years and I would like to get back into it, but, and there's always something that was keeping people back. And TTRPGs, at least for me, and I know for a lot of our mutual friends, has really allowed us to open up and be actual human beings with other people. I was like, you know what? People deserve this. Like, they deserve something better. Um, and so I really wanted to try to make something that would bring people in. And it started off with me just seeing issues with other systems. And as I was trying to like change those, and I started publishing just like alternate rule sets for uh, games that currently exist, I started to notice that I've changed so much that it should probably just be its own game by itself.
Right.
And so that's what I did.
Okay. Yeah. Um, so you kind of answered that it's a beginner friendly. It's good for like an introductory into the game, into TTRPGs in general, I guess, because a lot of TTRPGs can be pretty complicated. Like I have a background in lots of them. Um, there's fantasy RPGs, there's science fiction RPGs, there's apocalypse RPGs. Um, and like one of the issues that is with a lot of RPGs is that like it's like they have a niche on one thing. And
Mm-hmm.
so if you want to play in that kind of setting, you have to play that TTRPG.
Right. It,
And I'm pretty sure you were talking to me about this as a kind of like a setting agnostic, whereas it
right.
can be implemented in multiple. Like this is a fantasy game, this is a high science fiction game. Like, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So when we started developing the game, when I was doing it by myself, there was like two big things that I really wanted to find in an RPG system. The first being that, like, well, okay, so I'm going to back up just a little bit here. When I started playing Dungeons and Dragons, and my friend handed me the player's handbook, and he was like, "Hey, create a character." I remember opening it up and being like, "Oh, I want to play a really strong elf." And then I opened up the rule book and I was like, okay, look through the races. Okay, I found an elf. And it's like, oh, you get a plus to dexterity and like one other score. And I'm like, well, but no, my guy's like slow, but he's super strong. I was like, why am I being forced to have certain stats depending on race? Why is me picking a certain race dictating what I get to be?
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to do something that like really allowed that. And then the other issue was that after I played a couple campaigns of D&D, I was like, okay, I've played a handful of fantasy. Now I want to go and do something space oriented, or I want to do a survival, like a post-apocalyptic survival game. And I couldn't really find a system that really scratched that itch that did all of those. So what I started to do was I was like, okay, how do I make a character creation system that can span across multiple genres and multiple settings? And then how can I make an ability system that's very simple but fits all of those? And how can I create, and then I did all of that for all of these mechanics. And so basically what the game is right now in our core rule book, you get to pick what setting, what genre you like, and that kind of guides you into like how powerful characters are starting off. Because if I'm playing a post-apocalyptic survival game, I'm not going to be as strong. My characters aren't going to be as strong as if I was playing a superhero campaign. So we kind of implement like, okay, this is how strong the character should be from the session 0. And then we also include alternate rule sets. So like when I first started developing the game, I was really honing in on the post-apocalyptic like survival or horror. And so I made these optional rules that was like, if your players have to sneak past something and they make a sound, well, depending on how loud that sound is, you're going to cause a sound rating to go up. And then every once in a while, have the people that they're trying to sneak past roll a check, an awareness check is what we're calling it now, to see if they notice where the DC is how loud they've been.
Okay.
So
that makes sense.
Yes.
So that's like one example of one of those optional rules or whatever that you can add in. Okay.
And so if you think about it, like in a survival, post-apocalyptic or like horror games, that rule makes a lot of sense. Now, if I'm playing, I don't know, like a cyberpunk game where we're coming in hot and we're like trying to do a heist or something like that, that probably isn't going to be used as much. So you have these core mechanics, and then you have these optional rules that you can decide whether they're good for your game or not, and implement them depending on how the table wants to play.
Right. So it's also kind of like based on, you know, what the players want and the DM, or is it GM? I'm assuming the game master. Yeah, the game master.
Yeah.
What the GM and the players want, like collectively, they can kind of decide.
Right.
Hey, I really like this awareness mechanic. Can we implement that in like when we're trying to sneak or things like that? And it also, I think that helps like just the setting that you're trying to be in, like especially if you wanted to do like a horror.
Right.
TTRPG, that's something that, you know, a lot of TTRPGs don't get right because it's kind of hard to imitate that in a imaginary setting, I guess, if that makes sense.
Right. And so we actually have had a playtest group running, and I think they've done about 8 sessions now, and they've been playtesting it with these optional rules, and I get all this feedback saying that these optional rules is what makes the game. So like their sound mechanic is something that they're like, oh, you know, it feels like the stress of what I'm about to do is very real. And speaking of stress, we also have a stress mechanic that they do for this post-apocalyptic world where if something, like they write down fears of the character beforehand, and as those fears come up, their stress levels start to go up. And then at stressful moments, their GM asks them, okay, make a stress roll against a mental fortitude check. And if they fail, then they have disadvantages applied to their character depending on how bad they failed that check.
Right. That's cool too, because that implements almost like the backstory of your characters, like, oh, these are my fears. That affects what happens in games. So like you could be in a fantasy setting and be afraid of spiders. Now you're attacking a giant spider. Well, you know, in the manual, that spider might not have a fear attack, but because it's fighting you, it might have an ability to just make you scared of it.
Right. And I think the big thing to really hit home on that is that we don't want to tell the players we don't want to tell them what they're afraid of. We don't want to tell them, you know, what stats they're given. the character creation system is supposed to be as simplistic as possible. We ask you a list of questions of like, what your character looks like, what kind of has happened in their past, what they want going forward. And then we actually have them just assign their stats to their character. So it's actually a balance of just making sure that if I give a bonus over here, then I'm giving myself a negative somewhere else.
Right.
And that's the character creation system. Assign those things. And then we also have an ability system that if they want to have their characters be more powerful, if they decided that at the table before the start of a game, they can have abilities that augment their characters to be even more powerful.
For sure. So if the character creation is like really simple, like let's say a GM has worked really hard on building like this world and this epic lore, that lore in that world, that can be what totally like custom, and these rules can be just implemented right into it, right?
Correct. Yeah.
So like if a GM comes up with like all like let's say a alien space campaign and they have all these different, alien races and things like that, then the players can be like, oh, I want to be that, but they get to assign their own stats. So that issue that you kind of had with that, oh, I want to be an elf, but I'm not strong kind of thing doesn't pop up, but it's like, I'm this alien, but I have these abilities, I guess.
Right. My big question was always, why does race dictate anything in a TTRPG? Like,
right.
What? Like, I saw a TikTok recently where somebody was like, oh, orcs are only supposed to live to be 60 years old in like the player handbook. And they're like, oh, but I thought that orcs were supposed to be a lot like humans, just with like different physical traits. So why are they supposed to die at a younger age? And then they were thinking like, oh, it says in the player's handbook they're always like at war. So the only reason that they could be like younger, like they died at a younger age, is because they're actually just killed. It's not like in the player's handbook reflects that. They're like, why is there a race that like is said to live shorter just because they're just constantly killed? And I took a lot of issues with a lot of that stuff. And I took a lot of issues with classes. Like it extended out to classes like whenever I played Dungeons and Dragons, I was like, it's really cool that like I can pick a subclass and like I get features and everything. But what if I'm like, oh, I create a character and like I create a fighter and I'm like, oh, I really like this fighter subclass. And for my character's backstory, there's a ability from a different subclass that I like. Like, why can't I have both of those? And so I started like ask those questions. And after I looked at everything, I was like, you know what? Just take what you want. Like, don't let me dictate who you are.
Right.
Just have fun with the game. Yeah. Rule look at like in. I mean, that's
games
what
are
this
made
game
to
is.
have fun. Yeah.
Right.
Games are made to have fun, and so there's definitely, especially recently, there's been a lot of like hyper. I don't know the word for it, but like hyper fixation on like how can I get the best stats or the best things possible if I take 3 levels in this or 5 levels in this or 6 levels in this. And then it's kind of hard too, just because like, I wanted to be a fighter, but I wanted this one thing, but you can only get this one thing if you take 3 levels in another class. And it's like, why does that have to happen?
Yeah. So and that's where our ability system steps in. Right.
Right. Okay. That's awesome.
Yeah. So our ability system, instead of classes, we use archetypes. So in the core rulebook, there's going to be 24 archetypes that players can buy abilities from. And each of these archetypes have different levels of abilities of like how strong abilities they can have are. And then from the start of the game, if the group decides they want to play with abilities, they are given a set amount of these experience tokens. And the stronger the ability, the more cost of experience tokens it's going to be.
Okay.
And so when I buy an ability underneath a certain archetype, it makes the rest of those abilities in that archetype cheaper.
Oh, okay.
So if I, like for example, in the playtesting group, I'm playing a character that buys abilities mainly from the Juggernaut tree, which in like fantasy terms is kind of like the barbarian.
Okay.
And so we have moves like Cleave, where I get to attack 3 enemies in front of me, or Leaping Strike, where I get to jump 30 feet towards somebody, and if I hit them, I knock them prone, and I'm able to make a melee attack as part of that. And as I take those abilities, it makes the rest of the abilities in that tree cheaper. So I'm proficient in the Juggernaut tree. And if I'm like, oh, see, that ability in the assassin tree would fit perfect, I can
Right.
go out and buy that. It's just going to cost me a few extra tokens.
Right.
Now, the cool part is when they cross. So different abilities can fall under multiple archetypes.
Okay.
So if I have an ability that is good for, say, the Juggernaut and also the Monk archetypes, it goes underneath both of those. So if I have an ability that I bought underneath the Juggernaut archetype and it's cheap because I've already bought abilities in it, and this tree also falls in like a Monk one, it's going to make both of those archetypes cheaper for me.
Okay.
So then as I start to buy more abilities, it's going to allow me to branch out into other archetypes that already make sense for the abilities that I have.
Gotcha. So is this like this tree of abilities that you're talking about? Is it almost like, um, do you have to like get one thing before you can get another, or is
No.
it just by getting one thing it makes everything under it cheaper?
It just makes everything under it, above it, and in between cheaper.
Okay, so like if you wanted the one that was in the middle,
Yeah.
it might be a little expensive. Maybe you're an assassin, but you want to have a magic power of some sorts.
Right.
So it would be a little expensive, but boom, you get it, and now you can shoot flames out of your eyes.
Right. And that's totally something that you can do. So I would say almost every ability though falls underneath multiple archetypes. So
Okay.
it's not loose, but it's very just simplistic in the nature of it. So like we have it separated into 3 different, I guess, categories of archetypes. So you have the like kind of like the type archetype. So like Juggernaut. That's like when I say Juggernaut or I say Barbarian, typically everybody knows what type of character I'm talking about. We're talking
Right.
about the Hulk. We're talking about Juggernaut. Those are very like archetypal archetypes.
Yeah, right.
And then we go into element, so like air, water, fire, death, life.
Okay.
And then we finally go into magical, so divination, chrono, and then so let's say for chrono, anything that involves time of anything is underneath that archetype. Anything that involves gaining sight through the insight through the means of magic falls under divination. Anything that changes one thing from this to that falls under transmutation. So you can imagine as you go through like the Juggernaut stuff, or actually the elemental stuff, if I create something, that falls underneath, I can't remember exactly what archetype it is, but there is a tree or an archetype that actually focuses on the creation of new things. So if I'm producing water, if I'm producing flames, that falls underneath that archetype as well. And so almost every ability falls underneath multiple archetypes. So as you buy abilities, you start to get into a lot of different avenues that your character can go. So it becomes far more of like what makes sense for my character than it does like, oh, I get to go up this like one simple class. This is all I'll ever be.
Right.
And you can really just plan it out as you go. And I think the really cool part that it allows for is one of the issues I take with like class-based games is that no matter how the story impacts my character, I know I'm just going to get that ability later on.
Right.
But how does like the story shape my character then other than just how I play them? If, for example, like we're playing, our playtesting group is going through a horror thing, a horror playtest sessions where we have werewolves and we have vampires. And if I was bitten by a werewolf and I actively turn into him, I want to be able to take an ability that might represent that.
Okay, yeah.
So that this allows us to be like, oh, I am now going to be allowed to take abilities that represent how the world has affected me, other than just being like, well, I took this subclass, I took this class, whatever that looks like,
Right.
and I'm 10th level now, so I'm just going to get this ability.
Right. And almost in a way, because you as the player get to choose what abilities you want. So almost in a way, you can choose abilities that you think your character would want, not just things that you
Right.
get by being that class.
Exactly.
So like you don't have to be the strongest or the most powerful if it doesn't make sense for who you're playing. So,
Exactly.
because I mean, after all, it is a role playing game.
Mm-hmm.
It's not. Oh, I mean, if you the character that you're playing is I want to be the strongest person ever. Maybe you get all the things that make you the strongest person ever, but you have to buy those with your experience points, experience tokens. What did you
Experience
call them?
tokens, yeah.
Experience tokens. You have to get all those. But like if things come on along the way that affect your character, maybe you branch into other things, and you as the player get to decide that. That's a really cool
Yeah.
idea.
And so, for like one of the other cool things about it is that the naming convention and the rules, like how each ability is described and how it's used, is very open. So if you read an ability and you're like, oh, my character could definitely use that, you can flavor it however you want. Like there's an ability underneath the assassin archetype that's called execute. Seems very straightforward, right? I'm gonna, if a target's low, I'm gonna deal a massive amount of damage to try to finish them off. And when I was reading through all the abilities that we had created, I was like, my Juggernaut character was a pit fighter, and he had like this really special move to just finish off his enemies quick. So what if I took execute from the assassin tree, and that ability was that move, and it allowed me to try to spend a couple extra tokens by going in a different tree, beginning an ability that so better fit my character than almost any of the other abilities that were remaining in my tree.
Right. So I don't know if we can talk about like how do you go about getting experience tokens?
Yeah, so experience tokens are just given out through points of the game. Like it really depends on how the group wants to play the game. If you want to just set an amount of tokens that you get at the end of every session, you can do that. And we actually have a system that shows like if you're trying to progress this fast through the game, then give out this many tokens per session. GMs can also, if there was an exceptional moment of role playing, they might just say, take some tokens. Here you go.
Right.
Or if you completed a major quest or a major story arc, GM might give you more tokens. So we have actually recommendations on how many tokens you should give out depending on how fast you're moving through the game.
Gotcha. Awesome. That's really cool. Because, a lot of times, like, what's the quote? There's like a Stephen King quote or something that's like, it's the journey along the way,
Right.
not the destination.
Right.
And so a lot of times, like in role-playing games, you just kind of like breeze through, traveling places because you won't level up until after you finish this quest or things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the ability for the DM to give out tokens for, things that you encounter along the way, completing major quests and things like that, it almost incentivizes exploration and doing more than just playing the logistics of the game. I guess it can encourage role playing the game, which is what the game is like. It sounds like it's made for.
Right.
So.
Yeah. I really I love combat. Like in playing Dungeons and Dragons, combat is one of my most favorite things to do.
Oh yeah.
Because I specifically build my characters around combat, and then I go in there and I'm like, I'm gonna do all this cool stuff, and then I just don't use any of my abilities outside of combat, but I have an extremely fun time role playing my character. And for this, I wanted to make abilities that made sense not only inside of combat, but in just outside of combat, like having abilities that could double as like movement things so that you could use it in combat and outside of combat. One of my favorite abilities is time stop. Stop time. And that could be used in combat or out of combat.
Right.
And I also love, we use for some of the higher level abilities, we use a mechanic called overroll. So, actually, I'll probably have to explain how you actually use abilities.
Right.
But if you use an ability with overroll and you roll a set amount over what you had to use that ability, it actually has an additional effect. So like with time stop, if I overroll a certain number, I stop time for an additional amount of time.
Okay. That's cool.
So I should probably talk about the ability system then and actually like how you use abilities. So depending on how big of an advantage an ability gives you, it actually has an energy cost assigned to it. With obviously like higher level or higher tiered abilities, giving you extra benefits and not making it impossible to use, which is why we use overrule, so that you can get additional benefits without us giving that energy cost to be so high. So instead of, actually, I'm gonna get too ahead of myself. One of the issues that I take with some of the TTRPGs we've been playing, and I'm not going to call anything out, but D&D, at the beginning of the game, martial classes are insanely overpowered, and casters are typically pretty weak because you only have a certain amount of spell slots a day.
Right.
And then once you get to the end of the game, spellcasters have abilities that are so overpowered that martial classes just can't simply keep up.
Right.
So what I designed to try to take care of that was a system that both martial classes, not classes, I guess, just all characters, no matter what abilities they decide to take, can use. So what happens is that you have this energy cost associated with an ability, depending on how powerful it is. And then once you say, I want to use that ability, you just roll, add your modifier, and then if you meet it or beat how much the energy cost was, you get to use the ability. Now, in combat, though, let's say I use an ability that costs me 2 energy. I roll, I beat a 2, I get to use it. And then the next turn, I use another ability that costs 2. Well, now the DC to beat it is 4. And so as I go through combat, that starts to add up. So we've actually had people that are like, man, I've got a maxed out, I have to roll a crit here to be able to use this ability or else I fail. And then they did it and they were able to successfully do it. And then it makes for like such more engaging stuff. Like it shows that your character in combat is exhausted. And man, this dice roll really is like, oh, is my character going to be able to do what they need to, or is that all going to fail?
That's awesome, because like it's almost like the start of combat is easy, but you fatigue as you keep going on. Like you get more and more exhausted. That's a really cool way of implementing that.
Yeah. And then once you get outside of combat or like an encounter in general, because you can, as I said, you can use abilities not necessarily in combat, but let's say you're trying to escape like guards. You're trying to run away from the guards. You're using abilities to get away from them. Well, that's technically like an encounter just without combat. You're trying to run away. So once you get out of an encounter and you get what's called a breather, which is just your characters are able to sit down and have a breather for a bit, the energy score is reset. So then you can go around to the next combat, the next encounter, and do it all over again. You can do all characters can do what they're designed to do every encounter, instead of being like, oh man, I used a spell slot or something like in the morning to get something that I didn't think we were ever going to need to do done. And now I'm screwed in combat, not knowing we're ever going to fight.
That's awesome. So another question I have. So I remember whenever you first started like getting this idea for another game, you also had an idea of like kind of incorporating like a healthy mental into the game. How did you go about doing that with this game?
Yeah, so that was a long journey for us, and it was something that was really important for me to see implemented. And I realized at the beginning of it, I was like, hey, I am not a therapist, I am not a psychiatrist, and I want to see people truly be able to reap some benefits from the mental health aspect of tabletop role-playing games like I have. Like I would say that tabletop role-playing games has helped my mental health immensely. And that's one of the biggest reasons I wanted to see more people play, is so they could have that same thing. They could have connection with other people. And so I started doing research on mental health techniques, like stuff that therapists use to cure depression, and things that help people practice assertive communication. And I was like, I've got it. Like this is truly going to help people. And as I said earlier, I obviously knew that I wasn't a therapist. So I reached out to a clinical director of a non-for-profit called TakeThis.org. And the team there was just so warm and accepting. And they were booked out for a bit. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to leave these awesome mechanics right here. And we're going to come back to them after I'm able to do a consultation with Take This. And I was like, they're gonna love my mechanics, but I'm at least gonna make sure that they align with best practices. Because if anybody was gonna know it, it was gonna be them.
Right, it'll be them. Yeah.
Well, so I had that meeting not too long ago, and I started talking about these mechanics, and Dr. B, who is the clinical director for Take This, was basically like, I'm gonna stop you. He's like, I don't want to interrupt, and I can tell you. 99% of the time, the mechanics, like what you were talking about, do not work and actually have adverse effects on the table. Okay. And he said it in the nicest way possible. He was he was very professional about it. And he took his time to explain to me how these mental health mechanics, like talking about all of this stuff, could be very triggering to a table. And like if somebody has a panic attack at the table, then is the GM or anybody else at the table supposed to be trained to be able to calm that person down?
Right.
And if we're having people open up about their feelings at the table, well, then people could misinterpret stuff and take offense to it, or you could have some people that are just gaslighting people over the information that they've gained at the table. And it's not something that I initially thought of because I would never do it.
Right.
And I'm not everybody. So,
right.
So he talked about, hey, I think it's fantastic. It's very noble of what you're trying to do. And I'm also going to tell you that the absolute best way to help people with their mental health inside of this is to make the game as collaborative and safe as possible. Just to make it to where people can collaborate. They feel like they have an input on what's happening in the game. They have autonomy to control their character and themselves, and that they actually have a mark on the world. Right. And if you do that, they're going to feel open to explore themselves inside of the game. And he's like, and that's the best thing you can do for mental health in TTRPGs. And I was like, you know what? That's it then. That's what we're doing. And we had already started to do that with like very small changes. And this was before I talked to Dr. B, and this is something that I wanted to do, was to make the game as collaborative as possible. I wanted to fix the age-old issue of the character making a roll and the GM saying, okay, you did this. This is what happened, right? Because then that's just the GM telling the player, oh, this is what your character did. And I found that like a lot of times as a player, a GM would just say, oh, this is like what you did because of this role. And I was like, actually, that's not what I did. If I failed, I can tell you how I failed. Just let me like have control over myself.
Right.
So what we did was we assigned difficulty values to the role. So like you have very easy, medium, hard, very hard, and nearly impossible. And each of those have a set DC number alongside of it. So like I think it's really cool in combat. We try to do like improv stuff. If at the beginning of combat, the GM goes, this monster is a medium difficulty to hit. And then as a player, when I'm fighting that monster, I know that I can roll my attack, and then I already know if it hits, so I can describe how that attack looks. And I can describe what the monster does. And then the GM gets to add any extra things they would like on. Just like if I was jumping across a crevice in the earth that if I fell down into, I would die. And I need to jump over this. Okay, well, the GM says, that's nearly impossible. All right, well, I still got to do it. So I'm going to roll. I can know if if I've made it or not. And if I do it, that gives me the opportunity to go, oh, you see my character run up to this crack in the earth. I jump over it and my feet hit the edge and I start to tumble back. And as I'm just about to fall into the crack, I manage to catch myself. And it allows the character to feel like they have autonomy over themselves and agency over the world without stepping on anybody else.
Right. It gives them the ability to describe what they do and how they do it.
Correct.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's really cool. I like that. So I guess last question.
Yeah.
So I know you have up right now kind of a GoFundMe to help get this kind of started. So tell us about the GoFundMe, but also tell us about like I guess like the what's next for it.
Yeah. So to put this simply, we're broke. We have 6 individuals that comprise the All Chat Entertainment team, and none of us have money, or at least disposable money. So I really was like, for Kickstarter to receive funding, we need to be able to have art. We need to be able to have advertisements, and we need to be able to get the word out. So I need funding to be able to do that. And especially since the very first art project that we're thinking about doing is very near and dear to my heart. Actually, before we stop, I'm just going to dive just a little bit into that because I have a call to action on that as well. So I have currently a GoFundMe going that is for my own personal social media, where I basically outline exactly what we're going to do with every dollar. And most of that is going to go towards art anyways, and advertisements. Here in about 5 weeks, we will be doing the pre-Kickstarter, where we're telling people about the game. We're getting email lists going. And then a month after that, the Kickstarter will finally launch. Now, the art that I wanted to touch up on, something that I'm very excited about, and along with the mental health aspect of the game that I really wanted to include, and I wanted to make it as open as possible. So, like, as we talked about earlier, races don't impact your stats. You get to play the character that you want to. I think we can all agree that there's a lot of injustices happening in the world. And I understand that as a straight white male, I have a lot of privileges and kind of a louder voice when it comes to certain situations than a lot of other individuals do. They're not as, I don't even know the word for it. They're not as, I'm going to think of this. I guess privileged? Yeah, thank you. They are not as privileged as me. And I hate to say that. And I hate to even think that that's an issue in this world. Mm-hmm. So when we started creation of this game, I said, how can we as a group start to give individuals that don't have a platform to stand on and to speak their stories? How can we help those people? And so a couple months ago, I came up with the idea and I pitched to the group of what we're calling the Creator's Voice Program. And that is us working with TTRPG content creators and having them run contests, or if they already know of a fan that has an unrepresented voice, they're going to let us know about that individual. And we're going to take that content creator and that fan that has an unrepresented voice, and we are going to listen to their story. We're going to take it in, and we're going to turn it into an NPC and publish it inside of the book so that that character in that story and that voice has something in every last one of our books going forward. So we're very excited about that. And we don't want to be the ones to really choose the content creators or the fans that get to do that. We want the people to be able to do that. So if this is turned into a video later, in the comments, like, just let us know what content creators you'd like to see us work with, so that we can reach out to those and we can have them help us find the fans that have that unrepresented voice. And if you're wanting to help with the GoFundMe or the Kickstarter, whatever video you're watching this on, please just comment. Reach out to me. I will make sure that you get the information. And moving forward, as we go through things, we'll have links so that you can click, donate, learn about the game, whatever you need. We will try to make sure that you have something to do that on. So I understand that was your last question.
Right. Yeah.
So thank you for joining me. I greatly appreciate you
me.
talking about the game with me. And we'll see everybody on the flip side. Have a great night.